Hi, it's Katrina. Everyone knows the name, but few know their story. The Celts are Europe's greatest vanished warriors. They sacked Rome, they worshipped strange gods, and they were immortalized by ancient authors. They were feared across the ancient world because of their ferocity, and they were respected for their incredible artistry. Get ready to meet the real ancient Celts, the master metalworkers, the fierce warriors who fought naked, and the creators of a mythology that inspired everything from the Claddagh Ring to Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Welcome to the Celtic world. Just a heads up, I am battling a bit of a cold, so please excuse the frog in my throat, but the show will go on.
Who were the Celts?
They looted Rome, fought naked, sometimes, and put a price on the heads of their enemies.
Before the Greeks became obsessed with philosophy and the Romans paved Europe with roads, there was another group of people roaming the wild hills and dense forests of Europe. These people were united not by marble columns or city-states, but by bronze weapons, the power of nature, and warriors who thought pants were optional. And they were absolutely terrifying.
These were the Celts. The Celts remain one of Europe's greatest mysteries. They were a vast, complex network of Iron Age tribes that terrified the Roman world for centuries. The problem is that they deliberately never wrote anything down, so what we know about them comes from the biased accounts of their enemies and the artwork they left behind. The Celts were everywhere and nowhere. Ask a dozen scholars where the Celts came from and you'll get a dozen different answers. But here's what we do know, or at least what I could piece together. First of all, is it Celts or Celts?
The term Celt originally came from the Greeks. The earliest record we have comes from around the 6th century BC. The geographer Hecataeus of Miletus jotted down some vague notes about a strange tribe in Central Europe.
Over time, Roman and Greek writers began referring more often to tribal societies they called the Keltoi, so we pronounce it Celt.
By the 3rd century BC, these Celts, or Keltoi if you were Greek, were reported all over Europe.
You might be wondering, weren't the Celts only in the UK? I'm glad you asked. As the years went by, we were led to believe that the Celts were tribes that lived mostly in the British Isles, but they were all over.
Tribes of Celtic people could be found everywhere from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the plains of Anatolia in modern-day Turkey. There were Celts all the way in Turkey. Known as the Galatians, they settled in central Anatolia after being hired as mercenaries. Keep in mind that most major powers of the Mediterranean dominated the coastline and islands. So while the powers we are mostly familiar with today, like Rome, Carthage, and Egypt, were making moves on the coast and the sea, the Celts were busy carving out a place for themselves inland. Although they were everywhere, the Celts were never a single unified empire. There was no Celtic capital city, no unified Celtic language. For all intents and purposes, the Celts were a loose, stubbornly independent mosaic of tribes with shared roots, similar art styles, and very strong opinions about battle decorum. Linguists now break ancient Celtic languages into two groups. There's Gaelic, which itself is divided into a bunch of different groups like Irish, Scots Gaelic, and Manx. And if you've ever tried to learn Irish, you know it's complicated. And then there's Brittonic Gaelic, which includes the Welsh, Cornish, and Breton languages, which Welsh I think is even harder. Some of these, like Manx and Cornish, died out in ancient times and were dragged back into existence by passionate revivalists, people who just weren't ready to let their ancestors be silent. Today, 6 Celtic languages survive. In the days of the Celts, there were likely dozens, even hundreds of local dialects, none of which have survived the ages. Rome's worst nightmare.
Rome typically gets credit for being this unstoppable power, only brought down at last by the hordes of Goths from northern Europe. But nearly 1,000 years before that happened, the Celts absolutely wrecked Rome.
In 390 BC, a group of Gauls decided to pay a friendly visit to Rome. If you've ever seen the show Spartacus, you'll remember the Gauls as being Celts from what is now France. Gauls, Galatians, and Celts were all interchangeable terms. The Romans would eventually conquer and enslave them, but first, when they first met in the beginning, things went the opposite way. The Gauls sacked Rome and looted and burned the city, forcing the Romans to flee to Capitoline Hill. The future juggernaut of the Western world was looted and humiliated by war bands in sleeveless tunics and gold torques. The Romans never forgot it, and they never forgave it either.
The specific tribe that sacked Rome was called the Senones. They were led by a chieftain named Brennus, and they didn't just show up and sack the city unannounced. They had already won a few battles.
The Celtic tribe absolutely smashed the Roman army into pieces at the Battle of Allia. Then, when they sacked Rome, they stuck around. Rather than take their loot and leave, they besieged Capitoline Hill for months, making the Romans starve. They only left when the humiliated Romans agreed to give them a ransom of 1,000 pounds of gold.
During the transaction, Brennus made a famous quote, "Woe to the vanquished." Woe indeed, first for the Romans and later for the Gauls.
By the 3rd century BC, the Celts had sprawled across Europe. They ruled Gaul, Iberia, and Spain and Portugal, the Danube Basin, and central Anatolia. They were shaping up to be quite the superpower.
But they never quite reached the same superstardom as Rome, Egypt, or Babylon. Why do you suppose that is?
For centuries, the Celts had everything going for them, especially when it came to technology. They had all the ingredients to become a ruling power on the world stage. Celtic craftsmanship was more than just savage swords and war trumpets. At a burial site in Switzerland, archaeologists found a tiny golden globe less than an inch wide. Pretty cool, right? But listen to this. It was decorated with 3,600 granules.
That's a lot of granules. The goldsmith who made this thing had the patience of a saint and the eyesight of an eagle on espresso. I mean, that's just showing off, right?
Even their weapons were beautiful. The Latin sword from the tribe centered around Lake Neuchâtel in Switzerland features a hilt shaped like a warrior's head. It's complete with omega-shaped hair and almond-shaped eyes. If you're going to decapitate someone, you might as well do it in style.
The Celts clearly had all the engineering genius they needed to be on the same footing as their rivals. So why didn't they get ahead? I'll get to that in a bit. But first, speaking of heads, to the Celts, the human head was more than a body part. It was considered the sacred seat of the soul, the crown jewel of battlefield trophies, and an all-purpose spiritual battery pack. I'll explain.
In 2018, archaeologists digging at Le Caillard in southern France discovered embalmed human heads. These heads were 2,000 years old and arranged like grotesque hood ornaments. Experts believe they weren't for decoration, though. The Celts weren't building skull towers like the Aztec. However, the Celts were still considered pretty barbaric by their enemies. That might be because they hung severed enemy heads from their horses to boost their status and terrify anyone still considering a fight. They kept the heads not just as trophies, but as a way of keeping a slain enemy's soul. Since they believed the soul resided in the head, by stealing someone's actual head, they were capturing their soul and preventing them from enjoying the afterlife.
Pretty intense, right? I mean, cut my head off, okay, but then stop me from getting to the afterlife? That's a bit extreme. Although much of it had to do with their religion.
Druids, sacrifice, and sacred groves. You may think that the Druids were a culture similar to the Celts, or you might think the Druids built Stonehenge and worshipped tree gods in sacred groves.
And you'd be half right, or partially wrong. Depends on how you want to look at it. The Druids were not one culture. They weren't a civilization or a society. The Druids were merely a respected class of religious leaders within the non-empire empire of the Celts. Confused? I think I might have confused myself. But let me break it down even more.
The Druids were priests and people of knowledge who doubled as teachers, philosophers, judges, and healers within ancient Celtic society. The best comparison I can make is that Druids were like the clergy in the Catholic Church with all of their different levels. Not all Celts were Druids. It was more a social class. There were warriors, farmers, and ordinary people in Celtic society. And though they may have practiced Druidism as a religion, they weren't Druids themselves. The amazing part is how advanced the Druids were in the ways of science. They were some of the brightest minds the world had to offer. Around 43 AD, Pomponius Mela wrote that the Druids knew the size and shape of the earth. Caesar himself, who had a complicated relationship with the Gauls, having conquered them, said that Druids handled everything from murder trials to boundary disputes in an organized fashion. In the world of the Celts, the Druids were the supreme court, and the religious advisors for the afterlife.
Then there's this small matter of human sacrifice. You knew it was coming, didn't ya?
A poem by famous author Lucan, written around 40 AD, describes a sacred grove soaked in blood. This seems to suggest that the Druids were involved in human sacrifices. Other sources, almost entirely Roman, hint that the Celts might have occasionally offered up humans to the gods. Modern researchers aren't sure what to believe. Some think that the claims of human sacrifice were nothing but Roman propaganda. It was a way to make the Romans hate them even more. They were still really mad about getting sacked in 390 BC.
There is some evidence that the ancient Celts did practice human sacrifice. There are more Roman and Greek accounts, but besides that, there are bog bodies and depictions of sacrifice on artifacts like the Gundestrup cauldron. The rituals may have involved the killing of a king or the sacrifice of captives, and they were likely officiated by the Druids. But one thing ancient writers couldn't get enough of is how the Celts fought. Not just because they were good at it, but because of the presentation.
According to Greek historian Polybius, the Celts' frontline warriors would strip completely naked and rush into battle wearing nothing but gold torques and armlets, and of course their weapons and shields.
But why run into battle nude in the first place? Not everyone did it. Polybius wrote about the coalition of tribes the Romans called the Gaesatai. Gaesatai actually means serve for hire, so they were mercenaries who came together to fight the Romans. Other tribes were described going to battle bare-chested, but still wearing trousers and shoes. Fighting nude was not a universal custom. But for those that did, why? Historians believe it was for two main reasons. One was psychological warfare. Fighting like this displays confidence and would intimidate your enemies, don't you think?
And the second is that it was more efficient and free. By fighting without heavy armor, they could move around more easily and their clothing wouldn't get caught. This worked in the beginning, but as you probably know, over time, it began to work against them. The decline.
By the 1st century BC, the Celts were a dying breed. Rome, freshly victorious over Carthage at the end of the Punic Wars, began moving into Celtic territory in Iberia. And then Julius Caesar turned his gaze north and crushed most of Gaul by 50 BC.
Julius Caesar even wrote about the conquest in his best-selling war memoirs titled The Gallic Wars, available wherever Latin was spoken. It was the beginning of the end for the Celts, who just never made that final step to unite and go from culture to civilization. Had they stopped bickering and joined all their wandering bands and tribes into one consolidated power, Rome never would have stood a chance. Instead, Celtic power waned and many of their groups were absorbed into Rome. Others were pushed to the margins, forced out of their lands into even colder and more northerly territories. Eventually, the languages and rituals faded, remembered only in fragments, stone carvings, Roman commentary, and bog bodies, and gold spirals buried in the earth. By the time the Roman Empire was in full swing, the Celts were scattered to the winds.
But the story of the Celtic people isn't over. It lives on stronger than ever. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the Celts disappeared from history's front pages. Their name was buried until scholars and poets in the 16th to 19th centuries dug it up again, gave it a kilt, and handed it a harp.
It was mostly people in the Renaissance who brought the Celts back from oblivion. Then the Victorians became obsessed with them. By the 20th century, the Celts were back in a big way, with music festivals, scholarly conferences, and merchandise. Celtic became a cultural shorthand, applied to everything from football clubs to fleece blankets. But underneath all that cozy marketing, there is still the shadow of something older and far more mysterious.
The real Celts were artists, warriors, philosophers. They may have been the only people who could have gone toe-to-toe with the equally terrifying Vikings. More on that coming up.
Celtic Metalwork.
The Celts were renowned across the ancient world for their metalworking skill. Get ready for some amazing jewelry because these people didn't do subtle. Their jewelry was their bank account, status symbol, and lucky charm all wrapped into one.
The most iconic piece was the torque, which comes from the Latin word for to twist, which is how they were made. This was a massive rigid metal ring worn around the neck or wrist, often made from solid gold for those who could afford it.
This was the Celtic Rolex, and the bigger the better, as only the highest-ranking nobles, kings, and fierce warriors could afford one. Wearing a heavy gold torque was literally wearing your wealth, making you a walking, beautiful statement piece.
Roman accounts reported that Celtic warriors went into battle stark naked, but kept their torque on because losing the jewelry was a greater dishonor than losing your life. Beyond the heavy metal, if you see a piece of Celtic jewelry, it's usually covered in swirling, looping patterns that would have taken forever to make. The signature Celtic knot is an endless line with no start or finish, symbolizing eternity, the cycle of life, and the unbreakable bond of loyalty, which is much sweeter than what they were doing with their enemies' heads. Notice how many designs come in threes, like the Trinity knot or the triskele, which is a triple spiral. That's because the Celts believed that everything important came in threes: past, present, future, earth, sea, sky, or eventually the Christian Holy Trinity, seeing the cosmos as a giant three-part braid. These knotwork patterns were so visually powerful that Christian monks later adopted them into illuminated manuscripts like the Book of Kells. Basically, the Celts designed the coolest graphics, and the new religion said, "We'll take that for the Bible, thanks." While the torque is very famous, the most common item found is the brooch, or fibula, which was essentially a fancy safety pin used to fasten cloaks. There's a very special piece called the Tara brooch, which was a huge, intricate work of art. Then you have the famous Claddagh ring, two hands holding a crowned heart, which is actually a relatively modern design dating to the 17th century that was created to encapsulate romanticized Celtic values like love, the heart, friendship, the hands, and loyalty, the crown.
The reason we know so much is because we have found their treasure. The Snettisham hoards constitute one of the most spectacular collections of Iron Age precious metalwork ever discovered in Europe.
The site contained at least 14 separate hoards buried near each other in Norfolk, England. The hoards date to the late Iron Age, around 150 to 50 BC. The star attraction is the sheer volume of gold and electrum torques, over 60 of them. The centerpiece is the Great Torque from Snettisham, a massive neck ring weighing over a kilogram, or 2.2 pounds, crafted from 64 twisted gold and silver threads and featuring elaborate latten-style terminals.
It is considered one of the finest surviving examples of Celtic art. The size and wealth suggest the area was either the ritual heartland or the treasury of a powerful tribe like the Iceni, the tribe later led by Queen Boudica.
Then we have the Broider hoard found in Northern Ireland. The treasure collection is entirely gold and consists of 6 objects: the spectacular Broider collar, a hollow tubular gold torque decorated with stylized bird and horse motifs, a miniature gold boat complete with tiny oars, a mast, and grappling tools, a small gold bowl or cauldron, 2 chain necklaces, and 2 simple bar torques. The collar is widely regarded as the finest example of Irish latten goldworking. The style and the presence of the boat and cauldron suggest the hoard was a high-value votive offering, a gift to the gods, rather than just hidden loot. The whole collection is now the proud centerpiece of the National Museum of Ireland in Dublin.
The Celts also had highly decorated weaponry. The Celts were master ironworkers and were the first in Europe to make extensive use of the material, a skill highly valued by the Romans. Celtic swords and the scabbards they came in were frequently decorated with elaborate abstract relief designs and animal motifs in bronze or iron. These were status symbols, not just tools.
They also decorated shields. The Battersea shield, found in the River Thames, was made of bronze plates decorated with red enamel studs. It was likely used for display or ritual rather than combat, showcasing their artistic skill. For their religious rituals, the Celts made incredible vessels. The Gundestrup cauldron is a massive, silver-gilt vessel that is now considered the most famous example of Celtic religious art. It was found in a peat bog in Denmark, probably put there as an offering. The interior and exterior plates are covered in incredibly detailed high-relief scenes depicting Celtic deities, warriors, and ritual sacrifices. It's a key source for understanding Celtic mythology and a masterpiece of silverwork. Many examples of cauldrons or bowls have been found, often decorated with stylized animal heads or intricate patterns, highlighting their skill in working large, complex metal forms. Are you impressed? I'm impressed. Celts versus Vikings.
Did you know the Celts actually fought the Vikings? History loves to throw its heavyweights into the ring. Rome versus Carthage, Sparta versus Athens, cats versus laser pointers, but few matchups are as fun to imagine as the Celts versus the Vikings.
The Celts had already been around for centuries before the Vikings even picked up their first axe. Celtic tribes were spreading across Europe as early as the 7th century BC, shaking down Rome and making golden jewelry. By the time the Vikings showed up in 793 AD with their surprise party at Lindisfarne Monastery, which you might recall was in the first episode of the show Vikings, the Celts were already ancient news. But just like the Celts, the Vikings were also not one specific group, but seafaring Norse people from Scandinavia, who starting in the 8th century began to head south to raid and conquer Europe. They were also recognized as fierce warriors and skilled farmers.
The Vikings wouldn't have had any idea who the Celts were, but the Celtic peoples in the British Isles, particularly the Irish, Scots, mostly the Picts and the Gaels and the Britons, were primary targets of Viking raids.
The first interactions between them were violent raids, which later escalated into full-blown war. In the beginning, between the 8th and 9th centuries, Vikings started with hit-and-run attacks on the wealthy monasteries in Celtic lands. The Vikings eventually established long-term settlements in powerful coastal kingdoms, most famously the Kingdom of Dublin in Ireland. Later on, they controlled the Northern and Western Isles, which included Shetland, Orkney, and the Hebrides in Scotland, which means they conquered the local Celtic people. One of the most famous battles is the Battle of Clontarf in 1014, where the forces of the Irish High King Brian Boru decisively defeated a coalition of Vikings from Dublin and the Isles, along with their native Irish allies.
In terms of battle strategies, the Celts loved their chariots. Nothing says Iron Age swagger quite like riding into battle standing on a wooden cart, hair wild, gold torque gleaming, probably yelling something about your opponent's mother. Obviously, this was centuries before the Viking Age.
But we can compare the Celts of the British Isles who fought the Vikings to get a clearer picture. Vikings had longships, the sports cars of the medieval world. Viking ships were sleek, terrifying, and able to deliver 50 howling berserkers to your doorstep faster than you could say, "I thought we were at peace."
One side was delivering heads on pikes by chariot, the other by ship. Pick your nightmare and let me know whose side you would fight on in the comments.
Also, let's not forget the berserkers themselves. Viking berserkers were men who fought in such a frenzied state that even their own teammates wondered if they needed a timeout and a snack. Berserkers were the ultimate Viking warriors, unafraid of death and actually hopeful of dying in battle. Only death in a fight could bring a berserker's soul to the halls of Valhalla, where he could live alongside Thor and Odin and the other gods. If a Viking died of old age or of a farming accident, they'd be stuck in normal heaven, or no heaven at all. And that was the worst thing a Viking warrior could imagine. And while the Celts didn't have berserkers, they had their own ferocious charge that had a psychological effect. Their main focus was to break unorganized lines and cause panic. They were very good at that for centuries, and so were the Vikings.
But the Vikings had something the Celtic didn't: the shield wall.
This is where the warriors would stand shoulder to shoulder with overlapping shields. This formation required discipline and teamwork and was very effective. The Celts did not have the sustained, organized power of the shield wall, so once the battle started, they were more vulnerable.
What about their weapons? The most iconic and practical Viking weapon was the axe. From small throwing axes to the huge Dane axe, it was a common tool that doubled as a cheap and devastating weapon, capable of hooking shields and delivering massive damage.
The Celtic longsword was a traditional status symbol and a highly prized weapon, famous across ancient Europe for its quality since it was made of Noric iron. But that was old news by the time the Vikings came around. Celtic warriors often fought with long slashing swords, while the common Irish and Scottish foot soldier relied on spears, javelins, and axes. By the time the Viking Age began around the year 800, the Viking raiders had superior military gear like chainmail and iron helmets, which gave them an edge over the local Celtic forces in the British Isles. They didn't have as much metal armor and used a wooden round shield and layers of clothing or leather for protection. When they came head-to-head, the Vikings had the advantage. Later on, both vanished in their own ways. The Celts faded under the weight of the Roman conquest, blending into the empire until their name became more legend than reality. The Gauls and the Iberians were crushed, and their religion and language was replaced. Roman conquest in Britain led to Romano-British culture. Anglo-Saxon migrations pushed the Celtic Britons to the edges of the British Isles. As for the Vikings, they burned bright and fast. The Viking Age ended when they stopped raiding, but they still existed. They just lived differently. The end of the Viking Age was not the end of the Norse people or their culture. They slowly transitioned to Christianity, became farmers, and created kingdoms. The Norse peoples evolved from decentralized Vikings into organized Danes, Norwegians, and Swedes. The traditional end date is marked by the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 AD. There is no real end date for the Celts. Untangling Irish and Celtic mythology. At first glance, it might sound like splitting hairs. Irish mythology, Celtic mythology, potato, right? Not really. One is a carefully preserved tapestry of gods, warriors, magical swans, and boar-related fatalities. The other is a broad umbrella term for everything from horse goddesses worshipped in ancient Rome to a god with actual antlers growing out of his head. Celtic mythology is not exactly Irish mythology, even though sometimes people treat them like the same thing. It's easy to get them confused. Celtic and Irish myths are not the same, but they are family. Think of Irish mythology as one eccentric branch on the big, tangled family tree of Celtic mythology. And Celtic mythology itself is less a single religion and more of a continent-wide saga, with many different tribal spin-offs, linguistic flavors, and local gods doing suspiciously similar things. The real trick is understanding what people mean when they say Celtic mythology, since it can mean a lot of different things. Are you talking about the Gaulish Celts, the Irish, Welsh, Cornish, or Galician Celts, just to name a few? And since each culture takes you down a very different rabbit hole, I think it'd be fun to start with the gods of Gaul, the ones who were really scary. Ancient Gaul includes massive parts of modern-day France, Belgium, northern Italy, and a few other Euro hotspots. This is the homeland of the Gaulish Celts, the ones who really gave Greco-Roman writers something to gossip about. These were the Celts who rushed Rome, seized control, and extorted 1,000 pounds of gold from the starving Romans. These were also the Celts who were later destroyed by Julius Caesar. They had Cernunnos, the forest god with antlers, also known as the Horned One. He was the god of nature, fertility, wild animals, and wealth, symbolizing the cyclical processes of life, death, and regeneration. He's typically depicted as a serene, cross-legged figure with stag antlers, holding a torque, and often a snake. The Celts had their own god of thunder named Tyrannus, associated with the Roman god Jupiter. Epona was the horse goddess. She was so powerful and unique that she was adopted by the Roman cavalry. She was the protector of horses, ponies, donkeys, and mules, and was also associated with fertility, abundance, and the passage of souls. Sucellus was the god of abundance and boundaries. He was strongly associated with the underworld and the cycle of life and death. They even had their own version of Hercules, known as Ogmios. He wielded a club and was the god of eloquence and speech. He is portrayed as extremely old, bald, and suntanned, yet wearing Heracles' lion skin and carrying his club and bow. His most unique feature is that a group of followers are joyfully chained by thin gold chains connecting their ears to the tip of his tongue, symbolizing the irresistible binding power of his words. There are many others we know about, which is actually pretty incredible if you consider that the Gauls were forbidden to write down these stories because they were mysteries meant to be kept by the Druids. The Druids, the religious leaders of Celtic society, were strictly against writing down anything about myths, legends, or gods. Sacred knowledge was only spoken. Almost everything that modern experts know about these deities comes from Roman and Greek inscriptions, temple dedications, and some sketchy blurbs in Julius Caesar's war diary. There's almost no info from the Gauls themselves, which is a huge bummer because without their own records, we have to rely on Roman sources, and who knows how accurate they are. Remember, they hated them. Meanwhile, in Ireland, Irish mythology is not just Celtic mythology with an accent, it's an entirely different saga and an entirely different group of gods and beliefs. Irish mythology is homegrown, meaning rooted in Irish soil, and as you've learned today, the Celts weren't from Ireland. Long before outside influence ever hit the Emerald Isle, the Irish people had their own stunning pantheon of gods, the Tuatha De Danann, or the people of the goddess Danu. Like the Celts, these gods were also complex, wild, and full of magic. The Morrigan is their ultimate force of war, chaos, and fate. She's not just a general, she is a shape-shifting terror who appears before battles, often as a terrifying crow or a raven, to literally scream prophecies and psychological warfare at the warriors. She is the original agent of battlefield mayhem. Then you have Luch, the god of all arts and skills. He is a warrior. In fact, he wields a massive, unstoppable spear, but his true power is his incredible, multifaceted talent, making him the perfect master craftsman, strategist, and king. And finally, the Dagda, the good god. He's the big daddy figure of the pantheon, and his job is essentially to bring abundance and sovereignty. He has a magical club that can kill 9 men with one end and bring them back to life with the other. He also owns a legendary cauldron that never runs out of food, making him the ultimate provider. Other deities had clearer but still surprising roles. Meet Nuada, the former king of the Tuatha De Danann. You know him because he was forced to step down after losing his hand in battle, only to get an incredible silver arm forged for him, an ancient version of Iron Age prosthetics. He's a fascinating figure who embodies sacred kingship and the physical price of leadership. There are many, many more, of course, so let me know if you would like a separate video about Irish mythology. Each one of the Tuatha De Danann are deeply Irish gods, but, and this is where things get juicy, they have uncanny parallels in the Gaulish and Welsh traditions, and that is not a coincidence. Although these gods are all from different places, Celtic influence brought them together. Remember, by the 3rd century BC, the Celts were everywhere, and they spread these core beliefs about gods of war, craft, and the sea from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean. Let's play mythological matchup. The most fascinating discovery about Celtic gods is that they are all one big, slightly confusing family. Why is the Irish Lugh, god of all skills, the same deity as the Gaulish Lugus and the Welsh Lugh? Because before all the tribes separated into Ireland, Wales, and Gaul, they shared a common Proto-Celtic mythology. Think of it as ancient proof that all these different religions stem from the same 3,000-year-old source. Gods and goddesses changed name, shape, and myth across Europe, but they were all slices of the same Celtic pie, an Irish pie and Welsh pie. You get it. And here's a fun fact you can drop at parties. J.R.R. Tolkien, the man behind The Lord of the Rings, once visited the ruins of an ancient Celtic temple dedicated to the god Nodens. There, he learned about a silver-handed smith god and the temple's cursed ring. One cursed ring to rule them all. The man who wrote The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings was inspired by the Celts. The elven smith is a spitting image of Nuada, the silver-handed Celtic deity associated with Nodens' temple. See how everything is interconnected? Are there still Celts today? The concept of Celts exists today as a group of modern people who share Celtic languages, cultures, and artistic histories, or who descend from the ancient Celts in the western regions of Europe. The definition of a Celtic nation is hotly debated, but there are 6 traditional Celtic nations: Ireland, Scotland, Wales, the Isle of Man, Cornwall, and Brittany. The province of Galicia in Spain would also like to be added to that list. These places share Celtic cultural traditions and in many cases a Celtic language, or a language undergoing revival. Besides the more well-known places, Galicia in northwest Spain has a significant Celtic past and strong cultural ties, including ancient Celtic settlements, a traditional Celtic origin bagpipe called a gaita, and cultural aspects that contrast with the rest of Spain. If you didn't know any better, you could see a man in Galicia wearing a kilt and playing a bagpipe, and you might think you were in Scotland. So, if you could go back in time and be born into one specific Celtic tribe, which would you choose? Gaul, Welsh, Irish, something even more vague? Let me know in the comments. And thanks for watching. Let me know which culture you'd like to hear about next. See you tomorrow. Bye!